Welcome to Sculpting Utopia, a podcast exploring how we can build a better society. In this show, we'll be discussing a wide range of topics, including spirituality, art, alternative living, psychology, and much more. My name's Sonum. I'm a documentary filmmaker and a yoga teacher. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about hunter-gatherer societies. I personally am very fascinated by how we human beings used to live for the majority of our existence on this earth, living in small communities, in nature, which is obviously very different to how we live in today's urban societies. I'm joined by the very eloquent and adventurous Dr. Nikhil Chaudhury, an evolutionary anthropologist based at the University of Cambridge. He has spent many years researching hunter-gatherer communities and has also lived with the BaYaka tribe in Northern Congo. We have a really interesting conversation. He describes the BaYaka tribe's way of life, the principles and values they live by, how they organize their society, and some key differences between our modern individualistic societies and hunter-gatherer ones, which I think gives us a lot of food for thought. So we'll get straight into it. Hi Nikhil, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. So you've mainly worked with the BaYaka tribe who live in the rainforest in Northern Congo. Could you paint us a little picture about that community and how they live?
Cool. So they're technically pygmies, which in a biological sense, that term, it's got misused, but scientifically what a pygmy is, a human pygmy population, is one where the average male height is below 155 or 150 centimetres. And they're hunter-gatherers, at least traditionally. There's been rapid change. There's been long-term change and rapid change in that. Rely on hunting, then gathering tubers and, plants, leaves, fruits, and also a lot of honey collecting. Like the men will climb just with a harness made of vines, like 40 meters high for honey. It's such a incredible thing to see.
What kind of animals do they hunt?
Quite a few, like lots of different sort of antelopes and wild pig, pygmy crocodiles, monkey, even like tortoise. And I guess a few things to point out about them, which is actually shared amongst all hunter-gatherer populations that are studied now. And a lot of people think are representative of human communities and populations throughout our evolutionary history, but there's some debate about that. They're nomadic. So they live in these camps where you've got lots of huts, and each hut has something resembling a nuclear family, a set of parents and their kids, and then maybe an aunt will be there, or a grandparent, or a friend, or maybe it's just the nuclear family. But then in this small camp, I would say it's more like a hut is like a room, because all the huts are right next to each other, and then you've got this central camp area. So it's almost like each nuclear family is in a room, and then you've got this big living room in the middle, which is, of course, these are just made of leaves and stuff. And that facilitates their mobile lifestyle. They build these huts in like a matter of hours. And key aspects of their social organisation, that seems to be common amongst hunter-gatherers, as is egalitarianism. So there's no political hierarchy. I think maybe a misconception about human evolutionary history, or even hunter-gatherers now, is this idea that there's like a chief and like a dominance hierarchy. Hunter-gatherers are actually the most egalitarian populations in the world, like without a doubt. So there's no hierarchy. There's a complete rejection of dominant behaviour, a really heavy emphasis on autonomy. Generally, there's predominantly one would say there's equality between the sexes too, although maybe there's a bit of debate about that. But yes, generally egalitarianism.
And when it comes to decision making then, how does it work? So there are no elders or chiefs. Does everyone get a say? How do they make decisions?
Yeah, so with egalitarianism, there was a famous researcher who talked about the egalitarian syndrome and these core tenets, and one of them is consensus decision making. So everyone has a say, but it's not like you sit down and have a vote. There are these mechanisms you see cross-culturally that facilitate this consensus decision making. So where I work, they've got this thing called Musambo, where first thing in the morning, everyone gets up with the sun, but maybe just before people get up and out of their huts, someone who might want to say something would walk around the camp and shout, like they'll say, "Oka, Oka," which means listen. And then they'll say, they sort of say in this very performative way, they might say, "Oh, yesterday we went to the forest to try and go fishing and there were no fish. Like, why are we wasting our time on this? I say today we should do this." And they're just these mechanisms whereby everyone's voice gets heard and you end up with an equilibrium where decisions are made. But because of that emphasis on autonomy, if you don't want to do something, you just don't do it. There's absolutely no time for someone telling you what to do. If someone tells you what to do, you can just sort of laugh at them. No one would take an instruction seriously in that way. So yeah, I'd say it's generally consensus decision making.
That's so interesting. And so do the women as well do the oka oka?
Yeah, for sure. The men, the women. Kids don't do it so much, but even with kids, there's a lot of autonomy.
And so how big are these camps or communities?
Because they're nomadic, they don't actually have stable communities as such. So often I think when people think about mobile hunter-gatherers, they're thinking about these groups and then every so often they move in unison. But it's actually this fluid composition. So you've got these multiple families living together, and then my family one day might say, "Oh, we want to go to that camp and see that person or visit that relative, or there's a lot of fishing going on there," and we'll just get up and go. And then other people are coming. So you've got this constant turnover. So it's community size isn't stable. People would be surprised to know that actually, I think there's somewhere in the region of about 70,000 Central African hunter-gatherers. Again, lots of those are undergoing or have undergone transition, so maybe they're not hunting and gathering so much right now. And generally a camp, we call it, you've got a tiered structure. So you've got a hut, something like a nuclear family. Then you might have something like 9 huts in a camp, which consists of like 50 people. And then a residence pool, which I'd say is more like 150, 200, maybe even more people, where there's this fluid movement between camps and this turnover of the camp composition. And then you've got an even larger group, which sometimes people refer to as the ritual group, where people from different residence pools might come together for important rituals. And that might be more like, many hundred or even thousands of people. And then you've got the broader ethno-linguistic group, which is many, many thousands of people. So yeah, different layers of different sizes.
Okay, so what would their typical day look like?
Yeah, I often get asked this. It's tough. I don't think it's as routined as ours, but they wake up with the sun generally. So where I work, they wake up the equivalent of sort of between 5 and 6 a.m. Then they might be hanging around for a little bit and then go off in different foraging activities. And there's some division of labour between the sexes. So males do more hunting and honey collecting. Females do more fishing and gathering of leaves and tubers. Kids collect more fruit. The girls get involved in subsistence a bit earlier, so they might go collecting tubers and yams or fishing or collecting leaves. Whereas the boys, because hunting, it's not viable to try and hunt till you're a bit older. They're still playing around. The kids just go off during the day, do their own thing. The parents don't really know where they are a lot of the time. From about 1 or just after, kids will be experimenting with machetes and making fires and stuff. And then because of that, by 3 or 4, they're very competent with machetes. Well, they're certainly better than I am. But the kids spend much of their day in mixed stage playgroups. So from around 2 or so to around 16, they're hanging out, moving around. There often aren't adults. They're certainly not adult supervision, and they might go off in the forest and they're playing a lot, but they might gather some fruits and mushrooms too. Whereas with the adults...
How do they play? What kind of play?
There are different things. I would say it's not that competitive, and some anthropologists emphasize this. So it's not like competitive sports, like in the way I remember when I was at school, playtime was very much, we played football and you're trying to win against the other team. Their play is more like a lot of climbing, and often we think of their play as the key way in which they learn. So you might see young boys climbing with those harnesses I spoke about to collect honey, but they're climbing much shorter trees and they're getting that practice and developing that skill. And then you might see them, making little spears and practicing getting insects.
Yeah. Okay. So while the women are fishing or gathering, the men are hunting or...
They go out and make traps. Families often go together on honey collecting trips, but the men will be the ones who climb. Yeah, they bring the food. Generally, they bring it back to the central camp area, and food sharing is fundamental to their society and fundamental to human evolutionary history. It was, for various reasons, I think, a huge driver in why humans are so social. So they'll go out foraging and they'll bring the food back, and there's a lot of redistribution of food. Then they might go on another trip foraging, or there may be some days they don't forage much, particularly if they've got a lot of food from the day before. And yeah, there's a lot of hanging around. Women are often like making baskets or weaving mats, eating together often. Also, rituals play an important role. I think the frequency of them has gone down a bit, but they're still very, very common. And there, everyone in the community gets together and they have various rituals all related to different spirits of the forest. And that's something where literally, a breastfeeding baby who's a newborn will be there, and the oldest person who's, not far from their deathbed will be there. And these go on for hours, sometimes.
And what's the ritual like? Is it like with music or chanting or? Yeah,
so there's, in their sort of religious belief, I guess you could call it, there are lots of spirits of the forest, and these are sex specific. So some spirits are owned by females and some are owned by males, and at different...
Owned by?
Yeah, so you own a spirit of the forest. Okay, maybe own's not the right word, but they are... Only the males can interact with those spirits and be initiated into that spirit where you learn various secrets and you get to meet this spirit. So the rituals generally look something along the lines of lots of singing and clapping in synchrony. The singing sort of this polyphonic yodeling almost. And perhaps it's worth clarifying this point I made about them being sex specific. I think a lot of this is about sort of emphasizing the power of your sex. It's like a way of building coalitions amongst the sexes. So when women, Ngoku is a very common and one of the important female spirits, when they're dancing Ngoku or singing Ngoku, they're making fun of the men. They'll be dancing around and saying things like, men, why doesn't your penis work? Or something, like humiliating the men, and they're dancing around and a man can't go into where they're dancing. And similarly, like something like Sho, which is one of the male spirits, if you're initiated into that, the men they all have their arms sort of around each other like brothers in arms, and they're running, and then the women and children have to run into their hearts. And there's something performative about it. Well, it's incredibly performative, but underpinning it is a sort of message of this is our male solidarity or this is our female solidarity, and you can't exploit us, because if you were to exploit me, you'd have to be, or if you were to try and dominate me, you'd be taking on all of us males or all of us females. So it keeps that sex egalitarianism aligned. I think when you say the word egalitarianism, people think of this peaceful utopia, but actually some anthropologists call this fierce egalitarianism, because it's a sort of friction, tension, displays of power where the end result is an equilibrium of egalitarianism, because it comes through this fierceness and almost threatening, like, you can't dominate us women or you can't dominate us men.
Okay, so occasionally they'll have these rituals, and if they don't have rituals, they just have dinner together and then...
Yeah, and I think they still have dinner in their heart with their family. There is an area traditionally which is a communal eating shelter, particularly for the men to eat together. But even though they're eating separately in their huts, they're sharing a lot of food. So they're divvying out the food. You might put some food on like a plate or something and send your kid to run across and give it to another hut, to another family. And there's also, again, I think there would be debate about this, but some anthropologists, particularly social anthropologists, well, not just social anthropologists, but in some hunter-gatherer societies, including the Bengele, describe demand sharing. So some of the sharing, it's not like I give this to you, it's that you demand it from me and I can't say no. So even when they've got their food in their separate areas, you might come over to my hut and you like want something and you just demand it and take it. That's how people who describe demand sharing would say that's what goes on. I'm not entirely convinced. I think there's more structure to the sharing than that, rather than anyone can just take anything when they please.
And who does the cooking?
I do feel like the evening meal is maybe a bit more routine, and maybe, women are cooking more than men are. But sex roles, although there is a division of labour, which is really important, it increases efficiency, right? Specialisation increases efficiency. It's not a division of labour where you can't do like if a man is going through the forest and he thinks there's a tuber, he might dig underground to go and get it. It's not like, oh, that's a woman's job, I'm never going to do that. Similarly, it's not like a man would be like, oh, I'm never going to cook. I'm sure it's very frequent that the time might come up and a man just does some cooking. I'm just talking about biases in division of labour. I would say women don't hunt in the Bengele, but in just north, in the Aka, in the Central African Republic, and traditionally in the past, among the Bengele, there was net hunting, which is men and women do it together.
Yeah. And how about the leisure? So for that, so you talked about the kids playing, but what about for the adults? Like, what do they do for fun?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I do wonder this sometimes. I do wonder whether in these communities there is boredom sometimes. I mean, there's a lot of socializing, like the ritual is really fun and everyone's having a great time when rituals happen. There's a lot of sitting down and chatting. If and when they have cigarettes and alcohol, that's something social. From what I see, almost all indigenous populations, particularly when they're undergoing transition, and by transition I mean a movement away from their traditional hunting and gathering only lifestyle, alcoholism is a real problem. I feel like, am I missing anything? When I think about fun, I guess the rituals are fun, they're sort of just social, enjoying each other's...
Do they drum or anything? Play the drums?
Yeah, in the ritual, but that's what I mean, like music can happen quite often, but I wouldn't say they're just randomly drumming, like just when they're just hanging out for no reason. A lot of laughter, but I guess when you think about it, in the middle of the rainforest, what would be the leisure activities as such, beyond just socializing and chatting with each other?
I'm curious, so do you know like what they chat about, like when, they're laughing or...
I think I said this to you before we started. I think when you go to other parts of the world, even with people who are living in terms of their like socio-economic structure and lifestyle in the most different ways, you always... By underwhelmed, that says negative. It sounds like there are negative connotations to this. I don't mean it that way at all. In some ways, it's quite a lovely thing. Perhaps you're surprised at just how uniform humans are personally everywhere. So it's hard to answer that question. They're just having chats, they're talking about people, they're talking about something that happened, what they did, one thing which is, I guess, a bit distinct with the laugh, they're laughing about just their standard jokes, but just whilst we're on the topic of laughter, it might be worth highlighting, they do have this sort of ritualised mockery. So I mentioned egalitarianism, and again, something you see across hunter-gatherers is what we call like leveling mechanisms or reverse hierarchy. So if you think about our closest relatives, say chimps, we often think of dominance hierarchies like a triangle. You've got the alpha at the top and then you slowly move down and more subordinates. And some people say, oh, well, something that was fundamental in our evolution, particularly whilst we were hunter-gatherers, was this capacity for egalitarianism via reverse hierarchy, where you have you invert the triangle. So because we're capable, our social cognition allows us to form really large coalitions. If any one individual tries to be dominant, everyone else, they're actually at the top. You've inverted the triangle and they suppress the dominance. And if anyone, so laughter and mockery is something you often hear reported as the sort of first response to someone being dominant. Like if someone's telling me what to do or going around trying to be a bit of a big man, people might just sort of crack up. And where I work, they have this thing called moadzo, which is ritualised mockery, in the sense that, say someone's been behaving that way, the women might wait until he's around, like come back to camp and they know he can see, and they're like walk around, and one of them might have like their chest puffed out and like they're reenacting his behaviour and just laughing. And it's just this subtle thing like, oh, we've noticed the way you've been behaving, and you know, it's a joke to us. But I think if people continue to behave that way, then it escalates from mockery to, it can become, I guess, more confrontational, intense.
And how do they work out their disputes?
Well, one way is just moving. So people used to talk about voting with your feet. When you don't really like someone or you've had some tension, you might just move to another camp, right? There's nothing keeping you there. Another, I think I have seen some cases where there was some ongoing conflict and they did sit down, like some of the other people did sit down with them, and they almost had, not scheduled, but they sat down and were like, okay, let's discuss this. Again, it's not so distinct from our society, except for the voting with your feet thing. That is, their mobile lifestyle allows them to just be like, fine, I don't want to live with this person anymore in the same camp, so they just move on. When it's between men and women, then there can be, well, when it's happening at the time, you see that sort of coalition. I've seen a few times where there has been aggression and you do sort of notice the women are together if it's going in that direction.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, I sort of remember this instant where a man was being quite aggressive towards his wife, and then the women, you know, that coalition that I mentioned, the women were sort of supporting each other and being like, don't try it, sort of, we're all here. And you can also get de-escalation of conflict, particularly when it's between the sexes, with this embedded coalitionary thing where it's just other people supporting you to sort of dissolve any dominance, at least.
What about like crime, and is there any crime, or like do people sometimes become violent, or how did they deal with that kind of thing?
So they don't have material possessions, right? So what's fundamental to, I won't go into the details of this because it's a bit of a digression, but to what we call immediate return hunter-gatherers is they don't store things, and they don't even store food, and they're constantly moving around. So there aren't really possessions to steal. Violence does happen, as in any society. And as for, you know, like homicide, I haven't heard any cases. I would guess it must happen, but maybe it's harder when you've got communal living, when you don't have the privacy. You know, in our society, if you've got a premeditated murder, you might like be waiting for someone in a private area or in their home or something. I guess people are never in isolation because you've got this communal living. Like, people are literally never alone unless they really actively want to be and they go off somewhere. And I guess to some degree that must suppress the possibility for what we might call crime, just because if people are always around, you can't really be anonymous, and you're in effect always being monitored. So in that sense, but violence happens for sure. I think jealousy can often be a catalyst to violence emerging. That, I'd say, that's the main thing I've experienced.
And what happens in those cases? Are there any repercussions? Or?
You hear a lot of talk after, but I've never really seen any extreme repercussions. I imagine there are cases where there's sort of a pressure to go and leave and go to another camp if people are angry with someone's behaviour. Because,
you know, you talked about how autonomy is very important to them, but then they live in community even though, you know, they can move. So what kind of values do they really embrace, and what do they try to instill in their children and in each other, and what's their value system like?
I'd say in hunter-gatherers generally, and here, like generosity and pro-sociality, like being cooperative and helping others, is fundamental. And I mean, those values. So in evolutionary anthropology, I'd never think of values as arbitrary. It's, and I think intuitively we can always trace back, like, oh, this is why that's important in this culture or this religion. And hunter-gatherers sharing is just so fundamental to their existence, because hunting in particular is so unpredictable. It doesn't matter how good you are at hunting, you will go out sometimes, and more often than not, you'll come back with nothing. I mean, in the Hadza in Tanzania, I think when men go big game hunting, their success rate is sort of 1 hunt out of every 30. So because of this unpredictability, everyone relies so heavily on food sharing. The days I don't get meat, but you do, you share with me, and vice versa, and it reduces the risk. And since that's so fundamental, it's really embedded in their value system, the importance of generosity. In the Aceh, the worst, South American hunter-gatherers, the absolute worst insult is that you're stingy. So I would say being pro-social and sharing is so fundamental in their value system, and I guess you could say their morality, or what would be inappropriate behaviour, is not abiding by this pro-sociality.
And if someone is stingy or selfish, and then they kind of make fun of them, is that how it works?
So mockery is often a first step. I also mentioned Bosambo earlier, the thing where they walk around and it in the morning, and make these proclamations for everyone to hear. Ostracism is so fundamental because of that need for social cooperative relationships. If you're ostracized, you're in real trouble. So I think that's why it almost rarely reaches that stage. Unlike other societies, if you don't have storage of food and you're reliant on this unpredictable resource of meat, no one is self-sufficient. And if you're not self-sufficient, you just know it's not a good strategy to be dominant or be stingy, because then if you're ostracized or if others don't share with you, you're basically dead. And that again is why dominance hierarchies can't emerge, because if anyone tries to be dominant and gets ostracized, it's just not a viable strategy. A really good quantitative description of this was the work done with the Aceh, the South American hunter-gatherers, where they basically mapped out the food sharing and nutritional intake and found that an average family without food sharing would have less than 1,000 calories per person, which is obviously not good, on 30% of days. But once you account for food sharing in this redistribution of food, and when I get food I share it and vice versa, it's more like 2% of days, right? So it's just so fundamental to survival that I think it's deeply embedded to be generous, but also most people probably are generous and follow the rules because it's so intuitive that they're just in deep trouble if they did get ostracized.
So you mentioned that sometimes the children don't get enough to eat. So what's their quality of life? I probably am romanticizing that they live a really abundant lifestyle, but what is their actual quality of life?
Yeah, it's funny, the romanticizing is an interesting thing, because I think it was Thomas Hobbes, when he was first thinking about primitive man and stuff, he said their life is nasty, brutish, short, and it was all about the struggles of the uncivilized man. And then there was this period more in the, I guess it was 70s, where people were very disillusioned with like what happened in the Vietnam War and what was going on in the world, and there was this romanticization. They called it the noble savage era, where it was like, oh, these are the people who aren't capitalists, these hunter-gatherers, and they're just happy with what nature provides. And it was this sort of very utopian-like vision. I would say the quality of life differs. It's different to ours in different domains. So in terms of whether maybe it's better or worse, of course, disease and health are much worse there than, say, here. Traditionally, at least, maybe it's changing a bit recently, in hunter-gatherers you see infant mortality rates, child mortality rates, so this is prior to reaching adulthood, of about 30 to 50%, which is of course, absolutely unimaginable compared to what we see, and grief, of course, accompanies that, and that's very difficult, and disease is common. So those are the harsh things, disease and health. I personally feel in our society, I get more and more sure that a fundamental ingredient that is driving so many of our problems is the lack of community. And that really is polar opposite to what you have out there. So there's I think it was in the British Social Attitude Survey, which is this survey that's done every few years, and it asks all sorts of questions. One question which for me is telling is when they ask people, would you ask your neighbour for a favour? And that could be any favour, like borrowing the salt. And I think only 30% of people said yes.
30.
Yeah. Whereas in the hunter-gatherer societies, your neighbours are literally keeping you alive, right? It is a life or death thing. You're effectively around them constantly. There's such interdependence and community, and that when I contrast that to, say, in the south of England, some of the formalities that exist as soon as you go outside of the nuclear family, and what I would say is quite a rare informality, treating people almost like family, is so rare in individualistic societies. Certainly looking at what I see around me in the UK, it's so rare and very problematic for our mental and physical health. And that isn't a problem there. Everyone has social support and community. Whereas here, just to sort of establish how important that is for the difference in quality of life, in industrialized high-income societies, I couldn't believe this when I first saw it, but other than maybe smoking, your social network and social support system is basically the best predictor of your morbidity and longevity, right? Which is so unintuitive, that having people you feeling supported or having a large social network is actually what keeps you alive and keeps you healthy. And that goes as far as like how quickly your wounds heal. This is just such a well-established result now, how tied it is to physical health. Much more intuitive is how tied it is to mental health. And apart from a few mental illnesses, lack of social support is basically a risk factor for almost all mental health and psychiatric disorders. Whereas out there, social support really just is a uniform thing that everyone has access to, and I'd say they've got the hardest parts, but also what's the hardest part of our society, they don't have that problem. So yeah, that's very true. Ideally it'd be great if we could have community and a better quality of life. So I think this would be a good point to wrap up. Thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation. Cool.
Really enjoyed it.
I'm glad. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. I really hope you enjoyed that interview. There were so many interesting points, from gender solidarity to consensus decision making, voting with your feet, reversed hierarchy, and this emphasis on autonomy, while also having a very strong sense of community. I love the fact that generosity is one of their core values. And it's really interesting because in our modern individualistic urban societies, we're taught to be self-sufficient. We kind of just generally look after ourselves and that's it. But it's interesting that actually when you depend on others, you're more likely to be generous and kind because your survival depends on it. And I also really like the fact that they're not restricted, that they can just move on if they don't get along with the current community that they're in. They can just go along to another one. It would be really cool if we could live in a society where we had these amazing values such as egalitarianism, where there's trust and generosity, where we live in community, while at the same time having good health and a good quality of life. That would be the dream. My dream anyway. But we don't have to go to the extreme to become a hunter-gatherer society, but what kind of elements can we incorporate into our daily existence? And I think it would be good to reflect on the values that are promoted in our society. Do we really want a society where it's all about productivity, efficiency, acquiring wealth and possessions? Do these things really give us fulfillment and satisfaction. As Nikhil said, it's about relationships, which is really, tied to community. Especially living in a city, it's quite easy to feel isolated and disconnected. So perhaps there are some things that we can incorporate into our lives to build on this idea of community, trust, generosity. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you think. Would you like to live in a hunter-gatherer society? I mean, there are probably not many around, but it would be quite cool. I certainly would love to, even though I'm probably romanticizing it quite a lot, and I'm sure it'd be very difficult to brave the elements. And also, as I'm a vegetarian, I don't know how I would actually survive. But I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you'd like to find out more about Dr. Nikhil Chaudhury's research, you can check out his website, which I will put in the description. Thank you so much for listening. Please do rate this podcast on Spotify. There are some little stars that you can click and you can give me a rating, which I'm sure will help somehow with the algorithms. I hope you have a lovely day or evening, and see you next time.